Now, to show you how bad this position is for black, the computer's recommendation is actually knight h7. And if you're looking for an explanation, I don't have one. Here we go, ChessKid. Today I'm going to save you because I'm going to teach you how not to play an opening. In this case, the Caro-Kann. One of the most famous, maybe the most famous Caro-Kann game of all time. It also signaled the beginning of the end for mankind. This was computer versus human, Deep Blue versus Garry Kasparov, way back in the 1990s. And Garry decided to play the Caro-Kann, the c6 move, on move 1 in the deciding game, but it didn't go well. Let's take a look and see how he went down in flames. Now in this position, white can take, white can push, or white can defend, and that's exactly what the computer did. Deep Blue, knight to c3, putting that knight on a blue square. You see what I did there? Now after captures and captures knight to d7, there is a cheeky little move where you put your queen on e2 and you threaten knight to d6, but I don't think that the 13th world champion would have fallen into that. So instead, in this position, the computer plays knight to g5, just putting a knight on g5. What could it be doing there? Well, we're going to find out in just a minute. By the way, another cheeky threat, if h6, then suddenly knight e6 is a really interesting move, because if you take, then queen to h5 leads to checkmate in 1 after you put your pawn in the way. Now the funny thing is, black can survive by not taking, but it doesn't look good to let the knight go to e6. So instead, Garry plays knight on g to f6, bishop to d3, and this is a position where you just need to ignore this knight. Now, Garry does that for one move and plays pawn e6, so far so good, but after the other white knight developed, you just need to continue your development. A simple move like bishop to d6 might be my recommendation, but instead, Garry plays the no parking sign, and this is before we had ChessKid, so, well, I guess we can forgive him. He is, you know, maybe the best chess player of all time. But after h6, he didn't realize the computer would get really cheeky and play knight takes e6. This is a long-term piece sacrifice, something that computers are really good at today, but you know, 25 years ago, they weren't quite as good at it. So Garry was shocked that this move happened. There's a whole other backstory we're not going to get into. Now, if you capture the knight, then bishop to g6 check, and when your king moves, white will just castle, put a rook on e1, play moves like c4 and d5 and rip open your king. And although black is up a piece, it is really hard to develop any of black's pieces to meaningful squares. So if we go back after the sacrifice, instead Garry played queen to e7. Notice the knight can't come forth because it is pinned, so the computer castled. And of course you can't really take with your queen because then rook to e1 would already win the queen. So instead, this knight had to be captured with the pawn. If you don't take the knight at some point, you're just down a pawn, and knight c7 is still a problem. So Garry kind of had to accept the sacrifice here. And after bishop g6 check, at least the king was a little bit safer on d8 than he would be on the e-file, but the same sort of problems happen. White is just focused on one thing, opening up files. In fact, pawn to c4 with the idea of playing d5 one day is perfectly acceptable in this position, but instead, the computer played bishop to f4 to control some of those dark squares and not let the king run any further to the queen side. Obviously, c7 has been taken away. Now, I think in this position, Garry was afraid of this move pawn to c4, so he played pawn to b5 to try to stop it. Now, to show you how bad this position is for black, the computer's recommendation is actually knight h7. And if you're looking for an explanation, I don't have one. I guess the idea is to bring the other knight to f6 and then the bishop to d7, but that is a very artificial way of continuing and very slow. So instead, Garry did play this move pawn to b5, but then the computer just tries to rip open that pawn. And if the pawn takes, not only will the rook get in the game, but then this pawn can come to c4. Again, this idea of d5 is not going away. So Garry develops rook to e1, pinning this pawn, which is suddenly a very weak backward pawn. Knight to d5. Bishop had to save itself. Now the king ran to c8, but as you can see, he can't really run any further. And the finish to this game is just going to be white ripping open this c-file, because that black king, he doesn't want to be on any of these center files, but he doesn't have much of a choice. So after captures and captures, queen to d3, and it's pretty much all over at this point. I guess you could try to use your knight to defend the pawn, but if you do, that knight can one day get captured, but at least you get rid of the dark squared bishop. If you try a move like pawn to a6, then c4 anyway, and that c-file is becoming open. My queen and my rooks are both going to land there. So black tried bishop c6, but after this simple bishop f5, you don't really have a meaningful way of defending this pawn. If the rook takes it, we'll fork the queen and the bishop, possibly with the other rook coming into the game. So Garry played the best option, which is not a good one. He decided to give away the queen. Now technically he does have a rook and 2 minor pieces, but finally the pawn reaches its destiny. It gets to c4, it rips open the c-file, and Garry actually resigned here in 19 moves, losing the match to the computer. Had he played on, he didn't want to, he would have probably captured, but after queen takes this, bishop's in big trouble. You can't even play king here because that's a cheeky little checkmate, and I would not want to play black in this position. Although you've got enough material for the queen, you have no development and you do not have a safe king. So in the Caro-Kann, watch out for these trick sacrifices on the e6 square. Don't do like Garry did in this game, but you can do everything he did in the rest of his career because he was a pretty good player.